introduce Sue. So we're delighted to have Ingrid with us today. Ingrid is Associate Professor and Director of the African Centre for Migration and Society at Windsor University in South Africa. We're absolutely delighted to have you here. Ingrid's been a long time friend is what was in my head. Friend to PALS and active contributor to PALS. And one of the easiest decisions when I was on the committee a long time ago that we ever had was that year judging the PALS Postgraduate Prize winner, because Ingrid won and her work was so amazingly exceptional that it was just such an easy decision to make at that time. So we're absolutely delighted to have you back as keynote. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We were just saying that was 10 years ago now, so PALS has been a very important part of my life and my academic life, so thank you so much for having me. It's really lovely. Well, and I should also say thank you to everyone who organised my coming over here. It's a little bit more logistically difficult when someone comes from as far away as South Africa. Everyone's been really great, so thanks very much. I struggled quite a lot with what to speak about today, and I decided to use the opportunity to tell you about a piece of research I've been doing on asylum seekers in South Africa, because I know it's something that's just so incredibly topical here as well. And it's one of those topics where there is actually a very strong connection between what's going on in the South African context and what's happening here. And so I thought that was a good place for us to begin a number of conversations. The work we've been doing looked at people who have claimed asylum either on the basis of gender-based persecution, sexual orientation, or gender identity in South Africa. And I'll tell you more about it in a minute, but I thought it was a good place to start because I felt like what's happened for me in the Southern African context recently is that we've seen a re-emergence of particular debates that need much more careful feminist analysis. So in some ways, I'll use this as an illustration of what I think is needed, or to begin a conversation about what could be needed in terms of global and local alliances. And I think that's a theme that's becoming more and more important in the work I've been doing. It's also a strong tension, and it always has been for feminists, around how you connect the global with the local. And so I'll come back to it over and over again. But I am feeling, in my context, that this was quite personal, because I do think we've had a resurgence of quite crude analysis of what Africa is, how it should be, and how it should connect with the rest of the world. So for me, this is an opportunity to bridge some of that. So let me tell you a little bit about the research we did. We first started getting interested in this topic in 2007, actually. So some of what I'll speak about goes back years and years. And recently, last year, we sort of re-looked at it again. So in 2007, we started to do research in South Africa into claims that had been brought on the basis of gender-based persecution. And we interviewed the refugee status determination officers, which I don't think that's a term you use, but it's the people who make the decisions on asylum claims in the South African system. We looked at the rejection letters and analysed those. And we also looked at, we also did interviews with the appeal board, who hear a lot of the cases in the South African system for all kinds of anomalous reasons. At that time, there had only been one claim that had ever been lodged on the basis of sexual orientation. And that case was one on appeal, so there was no kind of analysis to be done. You get no reasons if you win the case, only if you lose. So what we did in 2014 was notice that actually now we had seen large numbers of claims on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So we wanted to go back and have a look, revisit some of this work. So what I'm going to say is really a kind of broad brush of all of those different projects that have happened over a long time. Asylum, for us, emerged as important for a couple of reasons. I feel I need to say this because I don't know if it's true here, but in the South African context, there is actually quite a strong sentiment in some circles that asylum has become quite irrelevant, just because of levels of migration, motivations for migration, and so on. But for me, it was really important still, because it is an international system for the protection of people who can't turn to their own states for protection. And in the African context, we have seen incredibly repressive laws being passed recently. We've seen massive kind of repression, particularly against same-sex relationships, but all kinds of gender non-conforming practices have faced incredibly harsh action from the state in many cases. So asylum continues to matter in the South African context in quite important different ways. The other reason why it's really important for us to look at the South African system, and when I say us, I mean globally to look at the South African system, is that it's really unique. Firstly, it's modelled on what is typical in the global north, rather than what's typical on the African continent. So rather than camp-based policies, we have an individual asylum-seeking practice, much like what you have in the UK. And so in some ways this is a reflection of South Africa's commitment to a much more global notion of human rights, and that's what I'm going to speak about quite centrally. But more than that, it's the only system in the world that has very explicitly written into the Refugees Act that gender-based persecution, sexual orientation and gender identity are grounds for asylum. So when most other countries use the definition of a membership of a social group as a way of dealing with such cases, South Africa has been very explicitly written into the law. So it's a very unique system, and to watch what happens with it is really important for us. Okay, so let me move on then and just make a couple of disclaimers that I think are necessary before I jump into the research. The first is that I found it quite difficult to do a piece of research that focused so centrally on the law, and every now and then I do get tackled by lawyers who say, no, but the law says something else. And I want to make it clear that clearly I realise that law and policy don't reflect reality, right? But rather that we need to understand what they're saying, because they do represent some kind of normative discourses. And in fact, what I'm going to talk about is precisely the disjuncture between what the law says and what happens, the very messiness of everyday life. And I do think there are important questions that maybe I won't do justice to now about what do we think the law is, or policy is, what do we think it does for us, because very often, particularly in my context, that's where we call for change. We call for change at the level of law, at the level of policy, and there is a strong theoretical question about what we think we're doing when that happens. And I think also what's really important in the South African context is the law matters perhaps a lot more than it does in other contexts. If you think of the political transition that South Africa went through in 1994, the first 10 years of change was primarily a legal change. It was about rewriting laws massively. And so what I really notice in the research I do across a range of topics, whether it's on children or you name it, is that people talk about the law all the time. It's incredibly meaningful to people, and there's a constant sense of trying to work with it, think about it, negotiate it, contest it, etc. But it figures largely. And so I think also we can understand the law as a kind of moral compass, and I think one of my anxieties of thinking about the law came from the influence that Foucault's work has had in much social analysis. Precisely because it's become quite unfashionable to think about law and to ridicule power. But he says something in the history of sexuality that I think is quite important, so I wanted to quote it here. He says, I do not mean to say that the law fades into the background or that the institutions of justice tend to disappear, but rather that the law operates more and more as a norm, and that the judicial institution is increasingly incorporated into a continuum of apparatus, medical, administrative, and so on, whose functions are for the most part regulatory. So it's in that context that I want to speak about law. I also want to speak about it because it is a symbolic gesture on the part of South Africa that is participating in a particular notion of rights. So that's all quite vague. Let me knuckle down to it and tell you a little bit more about the actual work that we've been doing. One of the things I was interested in doing was thinking about how South Africa participates in global dialogues. And in relation to gender and sexuality, these are really interesting, the way they play out. In 1991, the UNHCR released a set of guidelines on asylum claims that had been brought on the basis of gender-based persecution. And in 2008, those were supplemented with a guidance note on claims brought on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And in 2014, these were finalized and revised. So there's 3 sets of processes that have been set up in place, and a number of discussion documents and other things that supplement those and help to paint a picture of what kinds of conversations have been going on at the UN level. And I think that they're really interesting for the way they trace connections between migration and gender and sexuality. And in particular, I was intrigued because there was a very strong story that was being told through these documents, a very linear story. And it is as follows. The context of World War II and some of the horrors of that war led to a commitment that they shouldn't be possible in the future. And the 1951 Convention on the Rights and Status of Refugees is an attempt to recognize this and protect against it happening again. It was in the spirit of protecting people from the kinds of atrocities perpetrated in Germany at the time. It offers a definition of what a refugee is based on that particular historical context, but it's really important that it's intended to be a universal definition. So to work, it has to travel across time and it has to travel across space. It has to work in different contexts and different times. However, even at that time, there was a hint that there might be some exclusions inherent in this definition, in the definition of a refugee. And I think most of you who work in this field will know Thomas Spakenburg's work. He's a Dutch writer, and he points out that gender was in fact suggested for inclusion in the 1951 Convention definition of a refugee. So at the moment it says that a person is persecuted on account of race, nationality, religion, and membership of a social group. It was suggested at that time that gender be included, and the response was as follows. The original idea underlying Article 3 was that persons who had been persecuted on account of their race or religion, for example, should not be exposed to the same danger in the country of asylum. I doubt strongly whether there would be any case of persecution on account of sex. So it was kind of disregarded as a basis for persecution at the time. And many of you might know that since particularly the early 1990s, there's been a really strong lobby around gender-based persecution and about how it might be acknowledged as a form of violence against women in particular might be acknowledged as a form of persecution. Much of this literature was really, really useful and led to a lot of socio-legal analysis and advocacy around criticizing the ways in which the asylum system seemed to protect the stereotypical male kind of soldier and sideline the kinds of violence that women experience, such as domestic violence, as kind of private and interpersonal. Now, with time and hindsight, and I participated in those debates, I'm not actually sure that was the right way of doing it, but time and hindsight are useful things. So that's something we can talk about. But it was very much a debate that was framed along the lines of what was happening at the time around critiquing gender blindness and the importance of the gender mainstreaming agenda at that time and the critiques of it. But what has happened is that there's no doubt that the idea that there's such a thing called gender-based persecution has spread across the globe. There is this idea, and there's still a lot of critiques of the way that cases are handled, but the idea has spread. And in fact, to the extent that Jacqueline Barber fairly, not recently, actually some time ago, was able to report that in the US, women actually were more successful in asylum claims than men. However, she makes a really important point, which is that women's asylum claims, whilst they're often more successful, they continue to rest on very gendered stereotypes of what a female victim should be like, how they should engage with the process and perform their trauma in particular kinds of ways. So I think that's in a sense become the new form of advocacy, if you like. And what has been absolutely clear in the kind of analysis that's come out of that tradition of work has been the extent to which sexist and heterosexist stereotyping still continues to permeate the asylum system, even if women are doing quite well as asylum seekers in terms of getting recognition. Now, I don't believe that that's the case in South Africa, but we don't have access to all the asylum documents, and our Department of Home Affairs is not keeping the statistics on any of this. So anything we have is from what we can collect ourselves, usually through colleagues, human rights lawyers that we have good relationships with. So we don't know what's going on, but I suspect that's absolutely not the case in South Africa. I don't think women are more successful in getting recognition. All right. So I think that this kind of critique, that second wave, if you like, of critique, alongside the sort of the emergence of queer theory at the time, has led to much more attention to issues around gender identity and sexual orientation, and hence the 2008 guidance note. What is really clear, if you look at the UN documents that track this, is the extent to which there is every single time a recurring statement that universal definition is universal. It can be universal, but it's just being implemented incorrectly. And so there's a lot of training that goes on, largely on the assumption that there is some kind of either cognitive problem, so people don't think right, an attitudinal problem, or a kind of lack of knowledge problem, right? That's often the assumption behind the interventions to try to make the asylum system work better. Now, I tell you the story in this form because there is another really, really important narrative or theme that emerges from a reading of all the documents leading up to these guidelines. And that is this idea that with time, slowly and progressively, the UNHCR and its partners who work on asylum issues are increasingly bringing about the expansion of protection. That case by case, step by step, protection is expanding to different groups and different places, and it's getting greater and greater and greater, the coverage. It's a kind of an incremental process that it describes if you read the documents. And so let me give you a quote which will help you to see the tone of what I'm talking about. And this is from the guidance note, the 2008 guidance note on claims brought on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. It says that in recent years, both national judicial decision-making and academic writing have seen substantial progress in the analysis and interpretation of the concepts of sexual orientation and gender identity in the refugee law context. These developments have run parallel to and indeed drawn upon a growing jurisprudence and legal developments at the international, through UN human rights treaty monitoring bodies, for example, and the regional level. Okay. Just as another example, and in a similar vein, prior to the development of the 2008 guidance note, there was an informal meeting of experts, which was designed to inform how the guidance note was written. And it was really interesting the way the issue was framed there. There was only one African country represented, by the way, that was Kenya. They said, globally and in Europe, the situation of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people has become a much more public issue in recent years, as have the challenges they face. There is greater awareness in many countries of asylum that people fleeing persecution on account of their sexual orientation and gender identity can qualify as refugees under the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. I think that might be my typo there. Over the years, small steps, one case at a time, have been taken towards equality. So again, you see this narrative of a kind of increasing protection, increasing progressiveness, and gradual, slowly but surely, incorporation of excluded groups from the 1951 definition. There is another theme connected to this, which I think is really important, which is a kind of developmental metaphor. The idea that states or people in the states are becoming, in these states, not the states, in these states are becoming increasingly progressive, increasingly aware, and that there is a kind of development with some countries being ahead of others, for example. And again, as I said, any kind of barriers to that are seen as either problems of interpretation or problems of attitude. But there's a strong sense of states becoming more and more aware, more and more enlightened, and it's this developmental narrative that's really important. And I think that this became particularly ironic and clear when in 2012, Volker Turk, the Director of International Protection for the UNHCR, at a symposium in Geneva, was able to state the following. He said, I have no doubt that both the framers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and of the 1951 Convention were aware of what happened in Nazi Germany to LGBTI people. In 1936, the Nazis created a Reich Central Office for the combating of homosexuality and abortion, revised in the infamous paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, arresting people en masse on suspicion of homosexuality and incarcerated a good number of them in concentration camps. After the Second World War, it took a while for the world to acknowledge the LGBTI victims of the Holocaust. Despite the fact that there was no explicit recognition in the refugee definition of persecution for reasons of sexual orientation or gender identity, the drafters of the 1951 Refugee Convention used broad enough language to cover such instances, notably through the introduction of membership of a social group ground. Now, I think this is really interesting, and if you contrast it to the way in which gender was treated in the first extract that I spoke about, where it was kind of met with confusion that there could be such a case of persecution on the grounds of sex, which was how they had framed it at the time, it really seems quite ironic that we're able now at this point, toward 2012, to look back and say, well, in fact, this was always what it was always meant to do. And I think there is something about the universal definition that I won't labor the point now that lends itself to that, but we can discuss it if you're interested. But it is deeply ironic, and once again it means that in the end of his speech he goes back to what is in all the documents, which is this idea that somehow if there are exclusions, if there are biases in the system, if there is a failure to protect, it's because of it's because of a human error, poor attitudes, or something like that. It's not because of the definition itself. Now, I think this presents us, for those of us who are trying to do work in this area, with an incredible puzzle. Because in South Africa and globally, what we've in fact seen is an increasingly restrictive use of the asylum system. Very high rejection rates and very few people succeeding as asylum seekers, which seems to me to be the complete opposite of what's been talked about in the policies, which imagines ever-increasing incorporation of marginalized groups into policies. And so I found it very confusing. And in South Africa, depending on which of the annual reports you read, anywhere between 95 and 98% of asylum seekers are rejected. So it's clearly not a system of increasing protection for anybody. Now, as you probably guess, I'm also quite critical of this idea that somehow it's because of the attitudes or biases of the decision makers that that people are excluded from the system. And I think one of the most useful writers who I've engaged with recently is Julia Hornberger, who's written about policing predominantly. But she writes about the ways in which notions of human rights don't simply liberate by encompassing everybody, but rather they restructure and reproduce difference. And I think if we accept that, then we have to ask what kinds of differences are being restructured and reproduced. And I think that's one way of tackling that problem I alluded to earlier in the literature around how women's claims, even if they are successful, reproduce all kinds of sexist stereotypes. Now, I think that if we extend that argument, we can think that the asylum system really does operate first and foremost as an exclusionary system, one that is aimed precisely at excluding the majority in order to protect a very small minority. And this is something that's been taken up in Didier Fassin's work on humanitarian reason, and he's an anthropologist. But he writes on the French system, which is quite different, as I'll point out. But he says that he quotes a member of one of their committees as saying, one has to be almost xenophobic in order to make sure we protect the vulnerable. And this feeling of excluding the majority who are not entitled is really strong in the asylum system and is actually seen as almost a humanitarian act. And I think that's something of what's going on when we contrast these policies with the practices on the ground. So I would say that it's precisely because we have signed up to this kind of international policy and that we can, in a sense, justify the exclusion of a majority of migrants. And if you think, I'm not sure if it functions exactly the same here, but certainly in South Africa, if you think of the way that economic migration is treated relative to refugees, even if the harms might be just as severe, I think that we have to ask hard questions about whether the asylum system participates in justifying some of the other very brutal actions against migrants, including violence on the streets and including deportation and detention. Particularly if you think that, certainly in the South African context, it is possible under some circumstances to hold somebody who's undocumented for up to 180 days. Now, you couldn't hold somebody who has been accused of murder for that long, nowhere near that long. So it really has created, to use an overused quote, a state of exception. I also think that it creates a condition under which the majority of peoples who are fleeing some form of gender-based persecution are unable to access what is really the only system for protection, precisely because the definitions and requirements become harder and harder to meet. And I know that's quite a provocative thing to say, and there is a feeling sometimes that the asylum system becomes quite irrelevant or becomes a decoy for what is actually extensive violence against migrants. So I think I will spend a little bit of time now just explaining that based on some of the research of how, in fact, the asylum system seems to function far more for exclusion than for inclusion. Because I know it's provocative and a difficult question. So, in the research we did, and I should say that although I'm going to gloss over quite a lot of it, most of this comes from the review we've done of the rejection letters that asylum seekers have been given, as well as the interviews we did with status determination officers. And the key way in which the asylum system functioned predominantly to exclude was through this requirement of excessive violence. One of the most central discourses that was produced by the refugee status determination officers we spoke to is that violence, particularly gender-based violence of any form, is normal, and it should be expected. In order to be a refugee, that violence has to be exceptional. And, you know, the lawyers, if there are any in the room, will say, well, actually, in fact, that's true. To meet the conditions of persecution, there is an implicit assumption that some level of violence is to be expected. As one of the status determination officers said in one of his letter, there is no evidence that you suffered persecution or faced any special difficulty beyond the problems you would have faced in consequence of the generalized circumstances of your country. Now, this was in response to a man who comes from, who had a claim on the basis of sexual orientation, and he comes from a country where it's illegal to have a same-sex relationship. And actually there's been discussion of it being punishable by death. So there is a sense that there are generalized conditions that one should accept, right? And generalized forms of violence that are normalized. And I think that this was a very common form that the rejection letters took. And they functioned very strongly to normalize violence. It's also something that we've seen in the applications that are made in South Africa for resettlement. Resettlement in South Africa is very interesting, and very interesting because what it does is throw up tensions between the global systems of protection and the local ones. And the resettlement of LGBTI asylum seekers has been one of the key, has been really the only area of resettlement that's got attention. And in some ways it's because of South Africa's terrible reputation for abusing sexual minorities, right? So there is an organization that works in Johannesburg that works with the UNHCR, they're one of their implementing partners, and they specifically resettle people who have claims on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And when I asked them why, they said, well, there are other groups that do work with other groups of refugees, but of course no one else is doing resettlement, and I think you have to have some sense of the South African context to know that resettlement is like the gold star. It is what so many people want because conditions are so harsh for refugees in South Africa. And this resettlement is usually to parts of the US, so it really is an attractive option for people. And at first glance, this seems like quite a positive move. But what's really interesting is how they emphasized in the interviews I did with them that in order to qualify for resettlement, the person must be exceptional. Among the already exceptional group that have made it as refugees, they must show that they have suffered exceptionally in South Africa as well. And so this idea of exception just created layers and layers and layers, and it was really, really interesting. And it showed the very ambivalent place, as I've said, that South Africa holds within international ideas of human rights. Now, to the extent that if such a person ever did reach this organization, somebody who had suffered this exceptional violence, in fact, this organization can, and with obviously the support of the UNHCR, can bypass the South African asylum system altogether and grant asylum and have them move to somewhere else. There was one instance in which we referred someone for resettlement who had suffered extensive torture both in South Africa and in a country of origin. But again, in her rejection letter, the statement was that she was not exceptional in relation to other refugees in South Africa. What she had experienced was not sufficient to warrant resettlement. And so again, this idea that some level of violence is normalized is really interesting. Now, This, of course, is not unique to LGBTI claims, although that's where we're seeing it perhaps most strongly at the moment. And I don't have time to go into it, but I think it's for a range of reasons, predominantly that I won't go into them now, but we can talk about them more if you'd like to. We also heard it a lot in 2007 when we did the first research on gender-based persecution. And what we did was we asked some of the status determination officers whether they considered that rape was a ground for granting asylum. And time again we got the same response, which is, yes, of course it can be, but it can't just be a rape. It has to, not any rape, all right? Now legally that might be true, but I think we have to think quite hard about what that means. And it sort of brings me to another way in which the asylum system has in practice been functioning predominantly for exclusion rather than inclusion. And that is based on the gendered and raced nature of the claim. That's something we've seen very strongly. So what we did when we first started hearing these stories about not just any rape is we started to present to the status determination officers we were interviewing 3 scenarios. And we would say, okay, so is female genital mutilation a basis for applying for asylum? And they all said yes. They had training from UNHCR, this is a grounds for asylum, it's in. Yeah? That was their term, it's in. The second was rape, and as I've said, rape was dubious. Not just any rape would constitute persecution. And then the final thing we put to them was that of domestic violence, and they just laughed out loud. The idea that domestic violence could be a basis for persecution was outrageous to them, to the point that one of them actually said to me, you know, if I proved a claim like that, I'm sure they would accuse me of corruption or something, or having taken a bribe. So there was this interesting hierarchy of violences that was being set out. And I think that there is quite a strong literature that exists that looks at the ways in which female genital mutilation, as a lobby that emerged in the global north, was successful in part because it involved forms of violence that seemed exotic and extreme in the American imagination at the time, because it was predominantly in the US, right? And so there is a kind of theory of race at work in saying that that's definitely it. Violence as familiar as domestic violence, that's so much a part of our everyday lives, just could not get the same acknowledgement. It cannot be acknowledged easily as something so severe. And so, alongside the requirement of excessive violence was this idea of the need to protect the other from a backward and barbaric society. And it's, of course, a modern-day version of Stuyvesant's injunction that white men are saving brown women from brown men, right? We all know it. But it's a phenomenon that we're seeing still in South Africa. We've seen it around female genital mutilation, and we've seen it now strongly around trafficking as well. It involves a racialized recognition of the violence of the third world against its women. And it functions in large part to hold up the host nation, the receiving nation, as just and egalitarian. And again, this developmental metaphor is very strongly evident in that somehow some states, some countries have traveled the path towards justice and egalitarianism, and I'm going to come back to that. Now, I mean, I do need to at least briefly acknowledge that South Africa holds a very complicated position in this developmental narrative, right? At some moments it's the kind of icon of rights and progressiveness, and at other moments it's deeply repressive. But nevertheless, something like female genital mutilation is not familiar in South Africa. Whatever else may occur, that's not something that's common. And so it could function in much the same way as it did in the global north. Okay, and so then finally, I feel I just have to mention the third form of exclusion that we saw happening in the asylum system. And that is a kind of bureaucratic exclusion. And I do wish someone could help me come up with a better term, because I've thought about it a long time and I can't come up with it. But our asylum system functions, in spite of the law being almost identical to many other countries, particularly in the global north, our asylum system functions completely differently. We don't have what has been so heavily criticized in this context, where there is an excessive use of lawyers and doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists, and this kind of medicalization and legalization of the process. In fact, we have the absolute opposite. Refugee status determination officers take it upon themselves to say anything about anything, right? We have absolutely no use of professionals in that regard. And in fact, they've even now recently although it's gone to court and they'll have to bring it back. They've removed the right of appearance even for the asylum seeker in the appeal process. So we have none of that kind of, I don't know what you call it, of those kind of technologies of managing asylum that have developed in this context. Whether or not you get a hearing in the South African asylum system has a great deal more to do with whether or not you can get in the front door, right? Whether you can get your place in the queue, whether you can make it past a security guard, whether you can renew your permit in time, etc. Our system is run almost entirely by street-level bureaucrats, and the kind of experts are just not present. And I want to read you one of the judgments made by the refugee status determination officers to show you how quickly and how willing they are to just claim knowledge of all sorts of things. He said the following. He said, there's nothing in the hearing that could reasonably make the presiding officer believe that the applicant is homosexual. Firstly, he was not born homosexual, and he developed this conduct at a later stage following a number of his failed relationships, or a number of relationships that had broken down. The RSTO could not be convinced of this, and found the application situation to be more one of mere trauma than one of homosexuality. Furthermore, the fact that the applicant is enjoying sleeping with his fellow men is not automatically indicative of the fact that he's homosexual. He is still young and growing, and no one knows what may happen in the future. He may decide to go back to his heterosexual position and marry a woman. Now, I mean, it's an astonishing, and it really isn't uncommon to see those kinds of statements in the status determination officers in their decisions. And I mean, it's absolutely astonishing for so many reasons. But for now, to just make the point that he's quite happy to take on the role that would, in other contexts, be a professional role of talking about trauma and so on. And, aside from the issues around his conceptualizations of gender and sexuality. Now, I want to pause for a minute then and think a little bit more about what this means for us, right? And reflect a little bit on where it takes us in terms of the activism that's been happening and the research that's been happening on the asylum system. What's happened certainly in South Africa is that so much of our time and energy is taken up doing research that shows that asylum seekers don't get what they're supposed to get under law. And in some ways that's incredibly important, but in other ways it's also just deeply frustrating because we haven't really even got to the point where we can think about what the law does, what it can do, what it can't do. And I feel particularly concerned that we are relying on an asylum system that is really never going to deliver. Right? And I think is really set up in practice to exclude far more than it is to include. And that's something that sort of concerns me. I think that really, I mean, in our most cynical moments, I think that actually we cannot rely on the asylum system at all in our context. And there are a couple of quite pragmatic reasons for why that is. One of those reasons is that very small numbers of people can never get through the system and it can't function in the way it does given the numbers of people it sees. So there are very, very practical reasons. But I think that what's important to remember is that there are some exclusions that are not just about that. They are also built into the way in which human rights are conceptualized and the way in which the asylum system gets conceptualized. And I think that remembering what I've said about how the exclusion happens through the requirements of excess, the requirements of exotic forms of violence, the hierarchies of violence that determine what is acceptable in the asylum system and what isn't, and the kind of bureaucratic mismanagement we've seen mean that it's probably not going to be a solution. I think that one of the reasons that it can't perhaps be what was hoped for in 1951 is that we have to connect it to broader systems of migration and broader systems of migration management and what's going on in the world today, which was not what was going on in 1951. I think that put into its historical context, what we can see is that it functions within an increasingly repressive migration management system that has a number of functions. Firstly, it reinforces the idea that movement is something unnatural. It's something that shouldn't happen. It's something that's necessitated only in the absolute most extreme situations. And we see that just to give another example, in the ways that so many judgments here and in South Africa require this internal relocation idea. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but for those who don't do work on the asylum system, one of the most problematic responses is often that a person who's being persecuted could have moved to another part of their own country, right? And I think that this idea that one only moves in the most terrible, most violent kinds of contexts is one that we need to problematize. It also naturalizes place and nation as forms of identification and imagines that people should and do want to remain at home. And in that way, I don't think it's disconnected in any way from the much more violent practices of migration control, like deporting, detaining undocumented migrants, for example. And, you know, I mean, as we speak at the moment in South Africa, the South African government has engaged on a kind of massively repressive policing operation, as they call it, called Operation Fearler, which they say translates as sweep, although some people say it says clean, but either way it's very derogatory. And it's predominantly targeted undocumented migrants. And there are some court cases brought to try and make it stop. But in some ways what's really interesting is that the justifications for this operation have been entirely about the law. We have to maintain the rule of law. This is about keeping the law in operation. And it's quite clear that the law we have actually justifies widespread violence against migrants. And the asylum system as a kind of bubble of protection within that is functioning in many ways to continue to push people out of the system. And in some ways, I think it's only because South Africa has signed up to what is considered a very exemplary system of human rights that actually that kind of action can be justified. Because really it is within their legal entitlements. And so I do think we have to rethink the whole system in that regard. But I want to make one other point, which is that we have to think also about global feminist movements. And working on migration for the last 10 years has brought this just so acutely to the fore for me. I have real concerns about the ways in which local and global discourses on feminist discourses are kind of mutually constitutive in quite worrying ways. And if I think of, for example, the developmental discourse that I spoke about earlier, where there is a sense of increasing enlightenment, and it's very thinly veiled that enlightenment is in the global north, in the recognition of the rights, particularly of LGBT people. Alongside that, in the global south, there's much less writing on what's going on. And what's going on is much more difficult. But I think that just sticking with the developmental narrative for a while, Judith Butler has written very interestingly on how this functions. And she talks about how sexuality has been kind of, or advocacy around sexuality has been co-opted into the anti-Islamic movement in the US. She talks about how, and this is a quote, a certain deployment of freedom can be used as an instrument of bigotry and coercion. And that's what I think we have to worry about, particularly in studies of migration, but more generally. She also speaks very directly to this developmental narrative, where she says that progress in sexual freedom comes to represent modernity in very worrying ways. And this is another quote from her, where she says, sexual freedom is understood as ultimate signs of this developmental version of modernity. It is conceived as rights that are supported by a particular formation of secularism. We are being asked to disarticulate struggles for sexual freedom from struggles against racism. And I think that is something very strongly so we see that very strongly in the global discussions on migration. But, you know, whilst lots of people have pointed that out, whether it's in relation to FGM or whether it's in relation to the current anti-Islamic movements, it's not, there's very much less written about what this then means for those of us working in the global south. There's less of that. And I think that what we see is a discourse that is deeply connected to that developmental one, but is reactive. It's one that, very crudely put, says that all of these human rights ideas are un-African and don't belong in our context. And I'll give you an example that just came through actually a week ago. There is a very strong organization called the Coalition of African Lesbians, who finally, after a 7-year struggle, got observer status of the African Union. So NGOs have observer status where they can input into the human rights discussions. It wasn't an easy task, and nobody within the AU meant for it to happen. It was was on the agenda and it hadn't been noticed that it was theirs. Even in other years it had been noticed. And it slipped through. They tried to cancel the session, no one would allow that to happen. There was some people walking out, some people coming back in. Big furore, they got observer status at the African Union. So, much celebration. But then the Executive Council of the African Union made the following request, and so to speak, it's written in legal speak, but I want to quote it directly. It says, requests the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to take into account the fundamental African values, identity and good traditions, and to withdraw the observer status granted to NGOs who may attempt to impose values contrary to African values. In this regard, requests that the ACHPR review its criteria for granting observer status to NGOs and withdraw the observer status granted to the organisation called CAL, Coalition for African Lesbians, in line with those African values. Now, I think that this is an old story. We've heard this before, right? If you live and work in our context, it's nothing new. But I do think that this is not separate from the kind of implicitly racist developmental narratives that exist in the global north. And I think that the alliance between the two is really essential. One of the negative consequences of retreating back into these local versus global debates is that it has negative effects on the feminist movements in the global north and the global south. And so I think that although this isn't a new call, there's a really strong need at the moment to find ways of connecting across those debates and sidestepping some of these boundary divisions that have been set up. And I think that I feel it very acutely in my context because we are in a moment of such incredible retreat into essentialist and localized positions. And so I hope that in our discussions that can be one of the very central things that we take up and discuss. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Very much, and it's a really way to start the conference. I'll open the floor up for questions.
So recently there's been quite a lot around bisexual asylum seekers in this country and people being not granted on the basis that, well, they could choose to be with somebody of the opposite sex. And I was just wondering, given the example that you read out, it was really interesting how that kind of born gay discourse was in that, and also that, you have to be either or, so kind of Western understanding of sexuality is binary. So I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that, really.
Should I answer that then? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's really, really interesting that it isn't the kind of issues around bisexuality are not emerging much that I've heard of in South Africa, but it's really important because one of the other exclusions created in the asylum system that I haven't spoken about that many others have is the ways in which it fixes identity. So in the same way that women are now included in many ways but have to perform in particular ways, so too it's happening around sexual orientation and so on, that now there is a kind of rule about who's in and who's out and how you can and can't behave. And I think it's much of that dynamic that's at work there. So that's another kind of exclusion that's created. I think that there has been, what is really reassuring on the African continent is there's been a real resurgence of sexual politics that has problematized different forms and ways of classifying. But it's so dangerous at the moment because any kind of critique of what appears to be a kind of progressive inclusion, for example, of LGBTI people, so easily slips back into a thing that says, well, you see, this has never happened in Africa, or this doesn't belong in Africa. So we're constantly navigating that kind of discourse, which is really powerful at the moment. We've really seen a kind of retreat into that. So it's complicated, but you're absolutely right. And there's some people, I could really suggest Sylvia Tamani and others who are writing really insightfully and trying to also do a lot of historical work to reclaim some of what sexuality has been prior to colonization in Africa. That's really important for complicating the discussions.
Questions? Comments?
Just a comment, really, to Meg's point. The binary notion of asylum LGBT asylum seeking has come up in Britain as well. There's a case of a lesbian Nigerian who's been asked to prove she's a lesbian by making home videos. This is a real case. You might have heard of her, but you have to prove how lesbian you are to the Home Office. It amounts to this sort of gaze. It's quite sickening to think that people watching this video of a woman and her girlfriend prove she's a lesbian, and comes up in this country as well. This notion of she was married, she did have a child once, and is she a proper British sort of lesbian, not the Nigerian kind?
Yeah.
Because that's a different thing altogether.
I had heard of that case actually, it was from friends, and I had heard that in fact that it still wasn't successful, but I can't be completely sure of that. But it is that kind of process, and I do think, whilst in our context, all we have is the asylum system, and we have such incredible repression at the moment going on across the world. We've had such a kind of conservative move at the moment that people have to have some system for protection. But I mean, as I say, it is quite hard to imagine that it's going to meaningfully protect a majority of people who are faced with violence.
Great talk, thank you. I wondered if you could say a bit more about the way in which the asylum seeking system there doesn't engage with side technologies, and whether how that's seen, because obviously you know something about that system. So could you say something more about that? Is that useful? Because we're all busy critiquing science. As instruments of torture, but
yeah, no, I mean, it's very complicated, because there are moments, I have to say, where I kind of wish someone would bring in a psychologist. Well, I don't know. I mean, I agree with the criticisms of it. I think, it's difficult. I actually don't know the British system that well, so I don't know how much it's a phenomenon here. I know it from literature across Europe, so maybe it's more or less about in certain contexts. But I do think that given how poor the decisions we're making are, there are moments where I wish for it, but I also know that in the same breath I'd be the one critiquing it. It's a very, very difficult thing, and it still doesn't get to the fundamental questions of whether we really have any systems for offering meaningful protection for a range of gender-based violence. And that for me is the real problem. So yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think we could manage it, to be honest. I started working on asylum issues in 2001, and what we used to say then in our kind of more advocacy role is exactly what we're saying now. We have not managed to sort out the asylum system in South Africa. It's in absolute chaos. We've sorted out other aspects of migration, including passports, ID document, that sort of thing. But there is something about the refugee system that is just completely dysfunctional. And it does seem like, part of what complicates the politics is it does seem like there's a move now to set up camps. It comes and goes, pops up every few years, and then everyone says we'll never get past the constitution, and it goes away again. But they have started doing things like moving the refugee reception officers to the border, which would set up a de facto camp, right? Because you have to renew every month, sometimes for 5 years, right? Because it takes a very long time to get a decision. So there is a kind of real resistance to the system we have as well, and it's a real double-edged sword. Do you protect the system we have and try to make it more like what you have? Maybe that's better, maybe it's not. It's very, very difficult to know what the politics is.
Questions, comments? Can I help school? Wrong slightly. Really interested but not surprised to hear about women's claims being predicated on particular understandings of being a victim and survivor. And I just wanted to, I'm really interested in your work around rejection letters in order to kind of substantiate some of your claims. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that? Can you see some of that coming through in rejection letters, for example?
Well, you can, of course. course, you can hear all sorts of kind of sexist stereotyping, particularly around the ways in which people should really use systems of family mediation to deal with things like domestic violence. But of course, the really interesting thing is to know also why someone's accepted. So, and I had a really, and you don't get anything, right? An acceptance is just an acceptance, you get no explanation. I had a really interesting conversation with the chairperson of the Refugee Appeal Board, because most of our claims are actually going to appeal level for various bureaucratic reasons. And it was literally as I sat down, he assumed I was interested in women, and he assumed I wanted to hear about the cases. So as I sat down, he started telling me, you know, sometimes status determination officers don't know what they're doing, and he went on and he said to me, you know, there was this one woman who came and she sat down, and you could see that she was telling the truth. She started crying as soon as she came in, and she cried the whole way through. You could just see it. So of course I had to overturn their decision, and it was entirely based on his description of how she cried and when she cried. You know, and it's that kind of thing that's shaping it. So it's sort of an answer. Yeah.
I suppose I was interested in the sort of hierarchy in relation to rape and whether, and maybe domestic violence, isn't that they're looking to say it has to be politically motivated as opposed to a more, I don't know, civil nature. And then also just looking at clinicians working in that sector, it does seem that the stories of what gets you a sort of successful asylum application circulate quite widely amongst people. So it also starts to be something where people's narratives take a particular form or shape, and it makes it very difficult to intervene clinically with people because you know very often they're not telling you the truth in a sense of their experiences because they perceive clinicians as so there is a bit of this sort of side involvement as clinicians, as people who may be able to help their route towards asylum.
I mean, in terms of the hierarchies of violence, yes, rape by soldiers is seen more as in line with the convention than, say, rape in the context of domestic violence or anything like that. So there is some of that, but it also has to amount to persecution, right, which is a sort of additional level of violence, right? So, and then also, of course, you cannot be able to go to your own country with forced persistence because that's often the form of the rejection is that you should go to the police. And so often the decision making is based strictly on law. You have a law that says rape is against the law, and so you should go to the police. And that was even in one of the rejection letters we looked at, it was the police who had raped her. Right, and that was still the response. So yes, there are. It's about the kind of rape, if you like. And I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, I'm the last person who could answer it well, but I can't imagine what it does to a counselor-client relationship. To have the weight of this asylum application and to be in that position where they know perfectly well that it's probably going more on what you say than on what they say. I don't actually imagine that that's at all positive for any of the people involved. And I don't know enough about the details of that to say, but I think there are others probably who could. In terms of the stories, you're right that stories circulate, but you know what's really interesting, and I think that might be true here because people have a great deal more guidance through the process. You might see a lawyer, and so the lawyer at least helps you to know what in your story is relevant and what is not. In South Africa, it's actually quite astonishing to see what people say in there, and you kind of wish people had a bit of guidance, because really some of it is, and I do think it's just because people don't have access to lawyers. In the South African system, you would only really get a lawyer once you've been rejected. And then on appeal, it's so much harder because then you raise new things and that's seen as a credibility issue. So actually, I'm not sure that it's as strong in our context, but
just did some work when I was training in a refugee agency in the States. One of the things that we got asked to do was to write letters to support people's cases. And one of the things I was struck by, and I wondered, because because you commented, I don't know very much about the asylum system in this country, is that you're using in the US, I was using a diagnostic system that has very particular understandings of mental health to try and evidence PTSD, because we got clear guidance from the human rights lawyer that would be helpful. To try and match that to stories from clients who might come from contexts where arguably trauma might manifest in very different kinds of ways. And really, you were trying to write a persuasive argument that was based on a diagnostic system that was not really appropriate. So there were all sorts of ways in which it's problematic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, a blunt system like this just includes all the kind of debates and critiques around trauma and what it is and how it manifests.
Yeah, gold star for PTSD.
Yes,
if you don't make that criteria, you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's just become really, really complicated. It's so connected to what Jill was saying. I don't know how you begin to engage, you know. I mean, it really, I imagine, I'm not a clinician, but I could imagine that really the only relationship that's possible is a very pragmatic one around the application. You can't really engage in any kind of therapeutic, I can't imagine. But it's a conversation others could have better than me. But you know, there's also a cynicism towards professionals and what they're doing. There's now also, as you say, professionals who have a sense of justice often do write those PTSD type letters, and now there's also a suspicion of them that psychologists just write that, and doctors, you know. So it is a very difficult and messy context.
Questions, comments? Ingrid, thank you. That's brilliant.